Humans build technology to its highest peak, design the safest systems possible, and believe everything is under control. But nature never promises to obey human calculations. On the afternoon of March 11, 2011, Japan was having a day like any other. People went about their business, offices operated normally, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant continued supplying energy to millions. No one suspected that day would become one of the darkest in Japan's modern history. At precisely 2:46 p.m. Japan time, the Earth suddenly convulsed violently. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded, struck eastern Japan. Buildings swayed, workers scrambled for cover, and panic spread instantly. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, the control room became a hub of tension. The shift supervisor, Izaki, struggled to remain calm, giving firm instructions to the technicians around him. Emergency procedures kicked in. The nuclear reactor systems automatically shut down, as per safety design. The plant manager, Masao Yoshida, was visibly panicked in his office. Workers fled the building seeking safety. Yoshida gathered and accounted for his staff before rushing to the emergency response center. Back in the control room, the power suddenly went out. They scrambled to activate the diesel generators to restore electricity. They were still fighting hard to cool the nuclear reactors according to safety protocols. In the seismically isolated building, Yoshida received reports that the 3 active reactor units had been successfully shut down. They relayed this to headquarters. Yoshida then contacted Izaki with a dire warning. A mega tsunami was imminent. 30 minutes after the quake, the sea receded. Then came the devastating tsunami wave, reaching heights of 13 meters. Disaster alarms wailed across the region. 1 hour after the quake, the power failed again. The diesel generators had stopped. In a panic, Izaki rushed to report this to Yoshida. A stunned Yoshida, struggling to believe it, called the central government in Tokyo, urging them to activate the nuclear emergency protocol immediately. In the control room, panic set in as they realized they couldn't cool the reactors. This could spell catastrophe. The power had failed because seawater had flooded the buildings, submerging the generators. The tsunami was far larger than their worst-case projections. The plant had been designed to withstand various disasters and was built 10 meters above sea level. But it wasn't enough. Amid the chaos, Izaki stated they had to inspect the reactors despite the danger. If power wasn't restored, the water inside the reactor cores would boil off, and the fuel would overheat. The fuel rods could then melt, breach their containment vessels, and lead to a hydrogen gas explosion, releasing massive radiation. To prevent this, they had to inject water to cool the still-hot nuclear fission reaction. Even though the fission had stopped, the decay heat was immense. Their emergency cooling systems were dead, defeated by an unpredicted disaster. Izaki suggested an idea. They could use firefighting hoses to pump in water. Without pumps, only fire trucks could inject it. But 2 dispatched fire trucks were blocked by tsunami debris, and others were trapped by rubble. They requested the military's help. By 5 p.m., 2 technicians in radiation suits began approaching the reactor to manually open a water valve. Returning technicians reported dangerously high radiation levels in Unit 1, indicating something was critically wrong. A request for mobile power units was cancelled as they were too heavy for helicopters. They were desperately seeking another solution. By 8 p.m., 5 hours after the quake, the government held a press conference. Izaki's family at home listened intently. His wife tried to calm their daughter, assuring her not to worry about her father. By 9 p.m., residents within a certain radius were ordered to evacuate immediately. Using car batteries, the workers managed to check pressure indicators. Izaki was horrified to see the pressure had exceeded the design limits of the containment vessel. The reactor might hold until morning, but then it would explode. They had to perform a vent. While venting would release contamination into the surrounding environment, allowing an explosion would irradiate much of eastern Japan. The vented air would also pass through water in the suppression chamber, reducing the released radiation to about 0.1%. The problem was, with the power out, it had to be done manually. Someone had to volunteer to enter the already contaminated reactor building. A resigned Izaki reluctantly gathered his team to decide who would go. By protocol, they couldn't send the youngest. At first, there was heavy silence. Finally, Izaki volunteered himself. Immediately, other team members stopped him and stepped forward instead. They argued that Izaki, being younger, was needed to maintain command. Izaki was deeply moved by their sacrifice. Meanwhile, the government held another press conference, updating reporters on the crisis. Officials apologized and promised to resolve the issue swiftly so citizens could return home safely. They also expanded the evacuation radius. Residents within 10 kilometers of the plant had to leave immediately, with buses provided. By 7 a.m. the next day, the Prime Minister arrived at the plant. He demanded a detailed explanation from Yoshida and, learning of the plan, ordered the venting to proceed immediately to prevent greater disaster. 2 hours later, with the area evacuated, Yoshida called Izaki and ordered the team to proceed. The volunteers prepared to enter, equipped with oxygen tanks with only a 20-minute supply. Fire trucks had finally arrived outside, ready to help cool the reactor. The volunteers began slowly opening the vent valve. 15 agonizing minutes passed. Right at the 20-minute mark, as their oxygen ran out, the volunteers returned, reporting success. Now, a second team had to enter the reactor building itself. Inside, the heat was intense. They tried to push forward, but their radiation exposure reached the maximum safe limit, forcing them to retreat. Continuing would have been fatal. They were taken to the emergency building for treatment. Soon after, technicians from the stable units 5 and 6 arrived. They reported their units were secure and volunteered to open the valve in Unit 1. Having worked there for 10 years, they knew it inside out. Izaki approved, recognizing them as his own juniors and trusting their skill. But then, Izaki received a frantic call. Smoke was seen coming from a compressor. He immediately halted the team about to enter Unit 1. It was too dangerous. The mission was aborted. It turned out to be Yoshida's doing. He had used a compressor to vent the building remotely, achieving the same goal as opening the valve. Izaki was furious. His team had nearly become victims for nothing. In the midst of the crisis, a technician in the control room declared they should all evacuate to the safer emergency response building. There was nothing more they could do. Radiation levels were climbing, and they were in danger. Some disagreed, arguing, "Who will protect the reactor if the frontline team flees?" Amid the commotion, Izaki calmed them, stating they would all leave the entire plant area. But first, they had to ensure everything was as secure as possible to prevent the radiation from spreading further. The team reluctantly agreed to stay and monitor the parameters, accepting the high risk. Then, at 4 p.m., their worst fear materialized. Reactor Unit 1 exploded. Izaki ordered everyone to put on their masks immediately. News of the explosion spread rapidly. Evacuated citizens, many with family members working at the plant, panicked. Yoshida soon received a devastating report. They were running out of fresh water. They had no choice but to start injecting seawater into the reactors to cool them. A desperate, corrosive last resort. As the situation deteriorated, Izaki was forced to order the younger workers to evacuate to the emergency building first. Those who remained in the control room were the older, more experienced staff. They took a moment to take a group photo, aware this might be their last. Izaki was haunted by the memory of the Tokemura nuclear accident, where 2 workers died from radiation exposure. Their cells died throughout their entire bodies. Horrible isn't a strong enough word. he recalled. His mind flashed back to his student days, learning about nuclear technology. His teacher explained the containment unit, where boiling reactor water produced steam to generate electricity. Nuclear power produced vast energy at low cost, with no carbon dioxide emissions. It was the energy of the future. By 6 p.m., the government expanded the mandatory evacuation zone to a 20-kilometer radius. Meanwhile, the remaining workers continued the desperate fight to cool the reactors with seawater, a grim option born of utter necessity. The next day at 4 p.m., Izaki received a call. Radiation levels in Unit 3 were spiking rapidly. An explosion was imminent. All outdoor missions were cancelled. Izaki divided the team, with 5 people staying behind on rotating shifts while the others retreated to the safer emergency building. However, the next morning at 7 a.m., headquarters called, ordering them to resume work as usual, claiming pressure in the containment vessel was stable. Yoshida was furious at the reckless order from Tokyo but was forced to comply. He sent the outdoor crews back to work pumping water with fire trucks. Then, at 11 a.m., a massive explosion rocked Unit 3. Workers were thrown by the blast and struck by falling debris. They scrambled to evacuate the wounded. In the midst of the chaos, Izaki insisted it was his turn for a shift in the control room. Yoshida forbade it. Radiation levels outside were now catastrophic after the Unit 3 blast. But Izaki was adamant and went with a colleague to take their watch. Yoshida later received a report. Many workers were injured in the Unit 3 explosion, but miraculously, no one had died. He felt a wave of relief. He had vowed that if anyone died, he would pay with his own life. At midnight, the team in the control room made a terrifying discovery. Pressure in Unit 2's containment vessel was skyrocketing, far beyond its limits. Yoshida ordered them to do anything, venting, opening valves, to keep it intact. If Unit 2 exploded, the consequences would be catastrophic. While previous explosions were hydrogen gas, this would involve the radioactive fuel core itself. The nearby Daini nuclear plant would also be affected, potentially leading to a total shutdown of all Japan's reactors. Combined with Daini, 10 reactors could be involved, a disaster potentially far greater than Chernobyl. All of eastern Japan, including Tokyo, could be rendered uninhabitable. They waited for updates with dread. The pressure wouldn't drop, and the water levels for cooling remained critically low. Yoshida ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate immediately. Headquarters also began considering a full evacuation of all remaining workers. So far, 100,000 people had fled Fukushima. Journalists pressed the government. Was there any hope left for Fukushima? In the Prime Minister's office, they calculated the fallout. If the reactor blew, up to 50 million people within a 250 kilometers radius might need relocation. Faced with that risk, they made the grim decision to sacrifice the remaining workers, ordering them to fight to the bitter end. The Prime Minister resolved to stay with them until the end, vowing to die alongside them if necessary. Suddenly, a powerful tremor shook the ground. A frantic call came from the emergency building to the control room for the latest readings. When they managed to restore power to a monitor, they saw the pressure reading for Unit 2 was 0. The containment vessel had likely ruptured. A massive amount of radioactive material was now leaking. Panic set in. If the suppression chamber was gone, there was no way to cool Unit 2. Yoshida then gave the hardest order. Only essential personnel from each team would stay. Everyone else must evacuate. Team leaders chose who would remain. Those left behind were the bravest, those willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in a final bid for a solution. In the tense silence, they broke out their stockpiled food to calm their nerves, sharing their favorite snacks. Then they each called their families. This might be their last chance to speak to their loved ones. Meanwhile, the outdoor crews continued their desperate battle, pumping seawater into the reactors. Pressure in Unit 2 was still critically high. They connected more hoses, and helicopters were scrambled to drop water from the air. They fought with every ounce of strength they had. A short while later, the team in the control room checked the readings again. Their perseverance paid off. The pressure in Unit 2's containment vessel was falling. It would not explode for now. They immediately reported the stabilizing pressure to Yoshida. Cheers erupted among the remaining crew, the government, and even in the Prime Minister's office. It turned out the pressure drop occurred because a panel had blown off, allowing radioactive steam to vent. The explosion they'd felt earlier had come from Unit 4. Although Unit 4 had been shut down, hydrogen gas had leaked over from Unit 3, causing the blast. They had narrowly avoided a far more catastrophic fate. They were going to make it home to their families. Izaki was finally reunited with his wife and daughter. Their emotional embrace felt like the greatest gift after the nightmare they had endured. 3 years later, in spring, Japan was healing. Buildings were being rebuilt, and wounds were slowly mending. Izaki commuted to work as usual. On his way, he reminisced about Yoshida, who had recently passed away from a severe illness, cancer. Izaki stopped by the roadside, gazing at the blooming cherry blossoms. He realized a simple truth. Nature is not our enemy. It is a living entity just like us. And from that day on, Izaki understood that humanity can only survive by learning to respect nature, not by conquering it.